This is Identity at the Center.
Welcome to the Identity at the Center podcast. I'm Jeff, and that's Jim. Hey, Jim.
Hey, Jeff, how are you?
Oh, not so bad. Yourself?
I'm doing great. I'm really excited about today's episode. Not too often that we find a company that's been in IAM longer than we have, but I think we have one of those today. Also, we have a fantastic guest from that company, someone we met at Identiverse DC. So I'm telling you, that Identiverse DC conference was well worth our time.
Yeah, it was a lot of fun, and I don't have it in front of me right now, but I do have a Bravura Security IDAC custom tumbler or mug, whatever it is. So I definitely appreciate that. But yeah, let's get into it today. This is a sponsor spotlight episode, so this is where we find out, perspectives and opinions on the identity space from the people who make this podcast possible. So we definitely appreciate that. Today, we've got Bravura Security. You can find out more about them at bravurasecurity.com/IDAC. That's BRAVURA security.com/IDAC. And I want to welcome to the show Bart Allen. He's a general manager with Bravura. Welcome to the show, Bart.
Thanks, Jeff. Great to be here. Excited to kind of see the inside of how this is all made and comes together.
Yeah, so you're seeing the remote version. I think you probably saw us doing some live episodes at the Identiverse DC there, sort of the tail end of 2025. So you can see the sausage being made, the chaos/mess that is happening. But for whatever reason, people tune into that. Let's find out more about your background. My first question, anytime that I meet someone for the first time on the podcast, is to really kind of learn more about their background in identity and security. So let's start there. Bart, how did you get into the identity space?
Yeah, I mean, it's been a little bit over a decade since I started my journey in identity. Before that, I was in kind of an adjacent space, enterprise content management, controlling who has access to what and surfacing the right information, but really from a different angle. So I actually started at Bravura almost 11 years ago in our consulting space, helping customers solve identity problems and, figuring out how to improve their security posture. And then, through the years, kind of grew into more of a leadership role. Spent a lot of time trying to figure out how we can make identity an easier problem to solve. Saw many, difficult projects, long implementations, etc. And I think, that's something that I've really brought to the leadership role as well, as, paying attention to our customers, prospects, and the industry. But it's also what anchors me here. I think I love the fact that this is a space where the problem I was solving yesterday is different than the problem I'm going to be solving tomorrow. I mean, we've seen it in the past, 12 months with the evolution of agentic identities, and I'm sure we're going to see another evolution here shortly. So, that's what got me into it. I don't necessarily know that it was a path I chose or if it chose me, but I'm here. I do enjoy it and look forward to talking more about it.
Yeah, I feel like identity is one of those things, like just when you've got it figured out, here comes something new and interesting, and you kind of have to restart and kind of figure things out and tap that background to try and say, okay, how do we address this problem? So I'm with you totally on that. For people who are not familiar with Bravura, why don't you give us sort of like the rundown on who you guys are? Because you actually go way back even before it was called Bravura, right?
Yeah. So we were founded in 92. Back in the day, we really focused just on password management. I think our first product launched in 1997, which was just a self-service password reset tool. We've been through a number of different acquisitions and rebrands. So in the 2010s, we became part of Hitachi. A lot of people will know us as Hitachi ID Systems. And then in 2020s, in 2022 specifically, we took on the name Bravura Security. So, who we are and what we do, we've been around for so long that password management actually started to evolve into identity management. We were managing, passwords on Active Directory, Unix systems, mainframes, AS400s, you name it. And at some point, somebody thought, well, could we also start to create accounts? Could we start to deprovision accounts? Could we start to handle the identity lifecycle? And so we started to do that. We were probably one of the first vendors in the space. I don't think, it was something that it wasn't a space that existed at the time, I guess. And then similarly, fell into the problem of privileged access management. Had a couple of customers who were already using our password solution to reset passwords programmatically on a scheduled basis to secure privilege. And so started to develop a solution around that. And that's evolved into kind of the company we are today. I describe ourselves as like an end-to-end identity security provider. We're one of the only players in the industry with a native platform, and I think it gives us a unique advantage. Plus, the 3 decades of experience definitely can't hurt.
So talk about tapping at history just to make sure that you're doing right by the future. I'm almost curious how names of companies come to be. So tell me about the name Bravura. How did you and the rest of the people there kind of come up with the name Bravura for the organization?
Yeah. So, in 22, we knew that an acquisition was kind of nearing. We took the opportunity to do a bit of a product rebrand in advance of the company rebrand because we knew that was going to be very quick. Leaving the Hitachi ecosystem meant we had to leave that name behind as well. Which is, a very trusted brand. It revolves around, quality and everything like that. So when we're thinking about it, one of the things that came to light is our deep technical expertise. We have people who are still here today who've been here for almost 25 years. 25 years ago, the identity space didn't really exist. So it really comes from the root of, a word that describes technical brilliance or expertise in a specific space. And we thought it was kind of fitting, differentiates us from some of the others. So
I love hearing stories like that. It's like, all right, it's already interesting. So that's like an Easter egg. If somebody reaches out to Bart, it's like, hey, I know where the name Bravura came from. Now, that was the friendly question. Now I'm going to put my jaded CISO hat on because I feel like there are so many different products in this space. And identity at large just has, hundreds, if not thousands of products. So I'm going to ask you the question, like, what is it that you think makes Bravura unique? Like, what do you bring to the table that people should be thinking about? It's like, oh, maybe I haven't quite seen that before. Or what do you think is like that special sauce?
Our special sauce is the fact that we built this up natively across 3 decades. So that means we have a unified set of connectors for identity, privilege, pass, or password reset. And we can do things that require a lot of integration in other scenarios, right? You might pick a best of breed identity tool and a best of breed privileged access tool. And then you're posed with the question, well, where does privileged identity management happen? Does it happen in the identity tool? Does it happen in the privilege tool? And then if we want to go certify those things or, do deeper analysis, where does all of that happen? And oftentimes we find customers saying, well, it happens in, ServiceNow or some other platform where, we're not truly managing these things. So that's really, the core of the secret sauce. I think, what we're going to talk a little bit about today is again another one of those solutions that arises from having this native suite, right? We can, not only manage password resets, but we can maybe shift the paradigm on that as well. So,
Bart, I'm going to steal Jeff's jaded CISO hat. I'm going to put it on backwards, and I'm going to ask you this question. I mean, I'll be honest with you. Most of the episode, we've had way more episodes about the password dying and going away than we've had about how to manage passwords better, how to have a tool and a methodology and approach. So, one, I want to ask you, why is there still a need for a password manager? And then number two, I guess I'm going to help you out a little bit with this one, which is, look, as much as we might want to say the password is dead, and I think the first person to declare that, or at least the one that we've made fun of the most, is Bill Gates said it in 2006, the password's dead. And I think he was before even the crest of the importance of the password, right? That probably happened a few years later, at least. But it's 2025 or 2026. It's 2025, and previous years it's like breach after breach tied back to passwords, either phished passwords or socially engineered passwords or password spraying. I mean, it keeps coming back to passwords, right? So I guess that's my question is like, why is a password manager important now? And then why does this keep happening?
Yeah, I mean, I think a password manager alone is important, but talking about like why passwords, I think the uncomfortable truth about passwords, in my opinion, is we've been trying to get rid of them for the better part of a decade, probably even closer to a decade and a half, through one way or another. And we love talking about all of the things that are going to replace passwords, but I feel like that story continues to change and evolve, which is good. The industry does too. But I think we often ignore all of the things that are going to use passwords for the next decade or maybe even longer, right? There's legacy systems, there's platforms that don't support single sign-on flows or don't support standards-based single sign-on at least. And, you know, when we talk to organizations, a lot of them might get 80% of the way there, right? 80% of their systems are new or modern enough to support some sort of single sign-on flow or standard, which is great. Then you can eliminate the passwords there. But then what about the 20%? And I think where organizations get stuck is in this last 20% where you don't really reap the benefit of being passwordless and being, breach proof, if you can even say that, until you actually eliminate the user in the password flow or in the credential flow, which is what, passkeys and passwordless are really aiming to do. I think it aims to solve the problem of humans are bad at forgetting passwords, setting passwords, and remembering to reset them when they need to. So, our tech on that is really, well, there's multiple ways to solve that problem. And so if we think about using a password manager that's connected to your other systems and can automatically have passwords distributed that are very similar to how we would tackle privileged access management, then you're removing the user from that journey. They don't have to reset it. They don't have to set it initially, and they're not going to set a bad one that can be breached. So
Yeah, I think that's a really good answer. I mean, I use the password manager because even though I have passkeys available for certain applications that I use, there are other applications that don't have passkeys. They still rely on passwords, right? So what am I to do with those passwords? Write them down in a notepad or just reset my password every time? Obviously, the password is not dead. Even if we've beaten it to a bloody pulp, it's not dead, right? So that makes sense to me. I'm just kind of like thinking back through my experience, and I think the password manager I have, I've always thought of termed as like a personal password manager. And then there's enterprise password managers. I'm wondering if you could, for our audience, explain the difference between the two and then tell us what Bravura's solution is.
yeah, I mean, for me, the difference between a personal password manager and an enterprise password manager is really the paradigm of who has control over what's in that. I think a lot of employees, staff, contractors are using personal password managers for their business passwords, which creates an additional layer of business risk. And so an enterprise password manager is really just one that is geared towards an enterprise where they want to be able to maintain control of the credentials that are in that vault, even after that employee may have left, and be assured that, they're not getting leaked and have some ability to audit and see where they're used, what they're for. I like to think of it as like the last mile to passwordless, right? So you hit this 80% adoption and you're like, okay, great. So what are we going to do with the rest of this 20%? And I think a lot of companies go down this complex digital transformation journey where all of these systems are going to have to be upgraded or modified at some point, which is great, but that takes time. What they can do today is start to put those in a password vault. And then what our solution does that is a bit unique in the market as far as we can tell is from our lineage in managing self-service password reset, integrating with hundreds of different applications, including legacy mainframes, etc. We can actually treat these credentials like we would treat them in privileged access management, and we can rotate them nightly, every week, every 60, 90 days. And we get to set them. So it gives IT the control of the password back, and they no longer have to really be worried. The other thing that comes up a lot is, we get in these scenarios where a company has a breach and they have to go reset hundreds or thousands of passwords, and that's really hard to do. It's a lot easier to do when you can do it programmatically. And then you have a mechanism for distribution, because while you might be able to write, a PowerShell script or whatever that goes and resets all the passwords in Enter ID, then you have the problem of, okay, well, how do I get Jeff and Jim their passwords? How do I make sure that they are actually who they say they are, and I'm not just letting bad actors back into the system? So,
what you kind of described there is almost like a quasi passwordless type approach, where you're letting the wallet, the vault, whatever you want to call it, right, manage that for you. And me as a user, I don't have to know that. But I guess there's a little bit of a split here, though, because a lot of organizations are spending, and rightly so, money and time to get onto things like single sign-on, get MFA, get identity platforms in place, right? Things like that. So the idea is like, hey, let's get everything centralized. Let's use one strong credential. But you talk there about sort of that last mile, and I think that's where a lot of the operational reality still comes into it. Can you talk a bit more about what that breakdown is? Like, okay, great, we got 80%. What about the other 20%? Like that's still the key part of it that you're looking to address, right?
Yeah, exactly. I mean, I think, again, I'll kind of reassert the password's not gone until you're not using it anywhere. We talked to an organization recently, I think out of Identiverse DC, who was doing exactly this. And they took a different approach to it, which was they required people to reset their password in order to get access to their password, which is not super user-friendly. But when you talk about kind of the breakdown of systems, right, there's a lot of legacy technology. I mean, there's still mainframes in existence. There probably will be for, God knows how long, until IBM stops manufacturing them, perhaps, and selling them. But, that's not going away as quickly as we need to address the security problem, right? And so I think this is like a pragmatic approach to, okay, well, look, we're still going to go on this path and this journey, which, by the way, we believe in as well, right? Which is you want to eliminate passwords, you want to eliminate the human in them. But, what do we do in the meantime, right? So in the meantime, well, we have a secure way to deal with them. The other piece of that breakdown that enterprises really don't think about is, okay, I've got these 150 applications in my ecosystem that I'm going to manage access to. Well, what about the 150 to 500 applications that your staff are using for business purposes or otherwise, where they're still setting bad passwords because those systems haven't evolved to use passkeys or the users aren't comfortable with them? We talked about Identiverse DC, right? All of these events you go to, you create an account on some platform, be it like, Cvent or something else. And it's just the proliferation of more and more accounts. I think the last time I checked in my vault for work, I have about 10 to 12 managed credentials, i.e. things that are like really truly owned by the business. But I have over 300 items in my vault that are work related. And, I might be in a unique role, but those roles exist everywhere, marketing or people who are in consulting with access to customer systems, etc. So I think there's a lot more to it than what we actually see at the surface.
Yeah, that's what I was thinking too. As you were talking, I'm thinking like, okay, talk about like your GitHub password and things like that. That's in that 300 where they're work related, but they're personal accounts, if you will, that I think an enterprise identity person might say, here might be the challenge that you would get. It's like, well, we've got tools. I'm going to pick on Okta, even though I'm not picking on Okta. It can save these passwords. It can store the password. Is that enough? Storing the password?
I would say no, because you're not taking the human element out of creation, right? And what do I mean by that, right? we look at passwords and we look at the password dumps and we look at all the spreadsheets that people store their passwords in. And what you inevitably find is a pattern. It's not uncommon to see like my dog's name 2026 or, 78 because it's the 78th password they've set in their lifetime at that company. And so I think one of the issues is that we use these passwords and we use these patterns as humans because they're easy to remember, but we don't just use them at work. We use them in other platforms, and those other platforms occasionally get breached and, password hashes get dumped in places. But once we can figure out what somebody's pattern might be, it's not all that hard to run a very targeted, stuffing attempt to say, okay, great. I know that this person uses the password and it's their dog's name, Fluffy. And, they've probably been there for, 50 password change cycles. So let's try everything from 25 to 75, right? It creates a very targeted way to attack individuals. And so I think active management is really the only way to address that. So when you can reset it and also actively manage it, that's kind of the nirvana, I think.
Yeah, that resetting part I think is pretty important. So that's what you had mentioned earlier that kind of triggered me was, so you have the ability to go in and manage the password, reset the password on a periodic basis, things like that. Is that what I'm hearing?
Exactly. Yeah. I mean, we treat it basically like you would treat it in privileged access management.
So you talk about passwords being breached, and I think social engineering is another way that people get into accounts. Service desks have issues with validating callers, right? All kinds of stuff like that. And but I go back. My background in identity is IAM operations, taking phone calls from people on January 1st, well, probably January 2nd, who forgot their passwords over the holiday break, right? And you're trying to really get them in. And, back then, it really wasn't security. It was just like a process you followed, and it was like customer service versus a security control. And I'm curious, do you still see that taking place today? And what are your thoughts on sort of that approach?
I think help desks are evolving, but they're evolving out of pure necessity and based on what's happening in the market, right? It feels like 50% of the attacks, and this is not an actual statistic, are help desk social engineering related. In kind of the ones that I've investigated or looked at, thinking of like Caesars and MGM, that was help desk engineering. There was another one, locally here that was also help desk social engineering. Again, it's kind of like, the human element is the risk, right? And so if you give, admin rights, even delegated admin rights to your help desk to be able to go reset passwords, I mean, that again, they're following a process with the best of intention. But if there's nothing in the middle kind of enforcing that, we actually validated through like an IDV, for example, which is identity verification software, that, this person is who they say they are, or like a simple push notification or something like that, then help desks are going to continually fall to kind of those attempts. And so, again, thinking about the solution, right? If we can have a situation where users no longer have to forget their password because it's just stored somewhere for them, which is probably what they should be doing anyways, is using a password manager. But if we can get them there, then, a lot of the help desk problem goes away. Not all of it. I mean, you're still going to have first login scenarios and other situations where, hey, I lost my phone on a beach in Hawaii and I no longer have access to anything. My MFA device is swept into the ocean. But, if you can kind of put controls in place that technically, validate that the user is who they say they are before distributing access to their vault or their credential, then I think you can eliminate a lot of that social engineering issue that we're seeing, right? And so it really comes down to removing the human from the problem, Yeah.
Yeah. I think so. I'm writing a book, by the way, And it's a book of short stories about identity practitioners in the trenches, right? And so one of the stories is about a scatter spider type breach, right? Where they call the help desk and more or less socially engineer the help desk person. And the moral of the story is that the identity verification or the process wasn't designed to kind of think about that type of scenario where the person on the other end of the phone is saying, look, if I don't get access, I'm going to be fired. I think from a governance standpoint, we need to think like that. It's almost like putting together a disaster recovery plan. Like nobody wants to think about like these awful disasters taking place and taking out your infrastructure, but it's part of what we're paid to do, frankly. But I think, in a scenario like that, having a password management tool seems like it could make a lot of sense.
Yeah.
What are your thoughts?
I mean, even just kind of thinking of more basic scenarios, right? Maybe your phone doesn't get swept away in the ocean, but it came up on its 2-year term and you traded it in for a new phone without thinking about, oh, my my MFA authenticator is on there, which is something we see a lot of. I think you can see it in the data patterns and the cycles. But I mean, having a password manager in those cases, I think really addresses not only, forgotten passwords, but password strength. The other aspect of that, you talk about scattered spider, right? And I mean, these things are always, maybe not always, hopefully one day not going to happen, but that seems kind of unlikely. So if we accept that we're going to, have to deal with these, I think you talked about building resilience and thinking about this as like a disaster recovery plan. I think when you engineer your help desk processes, you need to be able to accommodate for the what ifs, right? It's, hey, I can't authenticate them by push. I can't authenticate them by, X, Y, or Z. What are the fallback options? And we see a lot of companies now looking at identity verification as one technique for that, doing, driver's license or passport recognition with liveness checks, which I think is generally a good practice, TBD on whether AI allows us to break that. But it seems like, those two are evolving in tandem, sort of, one step ahead of each other, perhaps.
At least until AI has driver's licenses, and then we've got problems. Maybe driverless cars. I don't know. But that's a whole different probably topic. I want to go back to what you said earlier about password vaults. And I'm thinking, and I'm sitting here and I'm like, okay, I've got a password vault. Jim, you mentioned you've got a password vault. I'm sure Bart, you've got one. But I feel like we're still in the minority. Like for whatever reason, a lot of people don't use password vaults. Why do you think that is? Like, is it a user experience thing? Like, how do we educate people to say, hey, you really should be using a password vault, and here's why. And how do we help communicate that out there, I guess is what I'm saying.
Yeah. I mean, I think part of it is education. Part of it is, people do what they're used to. And you saw this a lot like 20 years ago in terms of how people would manage their like personal PCs at home very differently than how they did things at work. But, as things evolved, it was more common for like home users to have antivirus. And so I think, one of the approaches really is enterprise password managers are not all that common across enterprises either. I think there's still kind of a slow adoption there. As practitioners, I think recommending that or looking at, how that can plug a gap is one important piece. I think also just dispelling the myth that it makes things harder, right? Like, I can't think of a world where I don't have a password manager on every device. Like, remembering that I used some unique thing for this website, maybe some pseudo algorithm to figure out a solid password. I don't think I could ever do that. So I think some of it is awareness. Others is, adoption. I think once we see adoption in enterprise and it becomes a more common day-to-day use case for people, then it becomes easier. The other thing we're seeing as kind of a side effect of doing what we're talking about and taking your Entra ID, your Okta, or your AD credential and actively managing it is that we're building a habit. We're building the habit that you never know your password and you're constantly going to your safe to get it. And then, people naturally start to put other things in there because they get used to that workflow. So I think a lot of it is familiarity. I mean, as with anything changes, a scary topic for people talking about, we're going to change the way people log in. I think, when passwordless was opt-in, a lot of people opted out until they realized that it made their lives easier and they could just scan their fingerprint or look at their camera, right?
Jeff, I think I have the answer for you. So if politics comes up at the Thanksgiving dinner table, bring up password management. You will never see the divide get worse, right? Of course, it's the identity people who care about good password hygiene and good practices, but everybody else is going to be like, I'm so sick of changing my password. If there's something that ruins lives, it's having to keep up with passwords, and you'll meet total strangers and they will unload on you when they find out what you do.
Yeah, you're the reason why I have to change my password. That's what I get from my barber and other people. It's like, what do you do? Oh, yeah, sorry about that. Well, we're trying to make it better, I swear.
Yeah, we're trying to make it better. That's the best answer you can give. Bart, help me out with my book here, man. So I'm trying to put myself in the mindset of that operations team, right? And Joe from the help desk, unfortunately, just potentially gave out the password to the scatter spider people, right? So we now know, like, hey, we may have a compromised credential on our hands. Hopefully, he didn't give like the domain administrator away or something like that, but he just coughed up a credential. Talk to us about those first few hours. What is happening?
Yeah. I mean, I describe it as like the fog of war sets in, and then you just all of a sudden lose sight of a lot of things. But I think a lot of teams get bogged down in the first couple of hours simply because they have a lack of visibility. And to your point earlier, they've never done this. They don't have a process for this. They don't even know, whether they should disable all accounts, a specific few, because hopefully they have some visibility tools, or whether they should reset them, or, where to start, I guess. And so I think a large part of that is, making sure that you have tools which allow you to actually have good visibility into your environment, understanding that, user X was potentially compromised. Yes, they have logged in using that new password. Yeah, it does look like they're logging in from, X country instead of, Canada or the United States where they usually reside. But then also being able to understand what that person has access to. You said, hopefully not a domain administrator account, but I'll play devil's advocate. What if it was? Because I think in one of the scenarios that I was thinking of in my head, it wasn't immediate access to a domain administrator account, but it was access to an IAM practitioner account. Which didn't directly have domain admin, but they weren't far off, and that's what they ended up getting. But so when you get into that situation and you need to, potentially disable or reset those hundreds or thousands of accounts in your directory, I mean, then what, right? A lot of companies we see get to that point and then they're like, okay, well, we can reset them. That's maybe the easy part. I said this earlier, right? You can write the PowerShell script. It's probably only a few lines if you do it efficiently. But then what? What does the rest of the process look like? If you're at a, 50-person organization and you're in person, yeah, okay, fine. Hand it out on hopefully not sticky notes, but you know what I mean, right? It's easier to distribute it because you're going to have that personal relationship and you can vet that everybody is who they say they are. But even if you're a small organization that's remote, how do you know that, somebody from finance is actually who they say they are. And, oh yeah, they need to reset their password because we reset everybody's password. So what we think of is actually kind of closing that, again, the last mile metaphor to breach recovery as well, is something that you can do with this kind of unique combination. We can look at, resetting hundreds or thousands of accounts, not only on a scheduled basis, but on like an event by event basis. You have a breach. Okay, great. Go reset all of the accounts, and make sure that they no longer have potential breach credentials, or that you're at least trying to lock out threat actors.
Bart, I'm kind of coming to the conclusion hearing you talk that we might be going and pitching a solution for passwordless or passkeys across the enterprise, but we're still going to have that final mile for the 20%. Let's call it 20%. It might be more or less depending on your situation, but it's going to be something where you can't do that. And where do we stand then? Like, do we put forward a solution and then is password manager really like the only viable option at that point?
I mean, you can take different approaches. Like I said, there was one organization who was forcing their users to go to like their password reset tool and reset their password, every couple of days when they needed access to those 20% of systems that actually required a password for login.
That sounds terrible.
Yeah, I agree. You could build your own. I talked to another business who built their own. I mean, if it were me, I wouldn't really want to build my own because it's kind of sensitive, and how do I know that it's actually been built properly? And
so you're not trying to jam this down anyone's throat, but basically the answer is like, this is the only sensible solution, right?
I think it's the only solution on the market right now that tackles the entire problem. You can bring in a password manager, and there's a lot of good password managers on the market. And you can encourage credential hygiene. But I think until you can actually, control user behavior or push user behavior in a certain direction, that's really where those solutions lack, right? You're never going to get 100% of adoption of a password manager solution unless you force the user to go into the password manager to get their password. I mean, we did this 2 years ago now, and I have no idea what any of my passwords are, and I haven't for a long time. It took us a while to get everybody on board, but immediately we saw adoption of the password management tool really uptick quite quickly. So, I think it's a good solution to a problem that the alternative is to wait years, maybe another decade, until everything universally supports passkeys or FIDO or some good appropriate standard. And by the way, I mean, password managers solve another problem with passkeys, which is portability, right? And so I think whether we see them now in the enterprise or in 5 years in the enterprise, I think they're still coming, and it's a necessity, but it might be from a different angle of, a passkey manager rather than a password manager.
I'm glad you brought that up because, I think it was probably 5 years ago, I didn't see a future for password managers because passwordless here, we're not going to need that. But you're absolutely right. Like, you need to be able to have a cross-platform sort of vendor-neutral wallet of some sort, vault, whatever we want to call it, right? They all kind of do the same thing.
Yep.
And that's where passkeys are really powerful, is if you can sync it from one device to another and still retain control from a management standpoint, right? Because obviously you don't want to sync work credentials with private credentials and that mess. But if you've got a way to solve for that, there is absolutely a place I see for vaults and wallets and managers and things like that to be able to do that passkey synchronization and that portability. So I'm glad you brought that up.
Yeah. I mean, I think I hope passwords go away in the next decade, but I think the reality and the data shows that they probably won't. I think I looked at a report earlier today that said we're only at 20% adoption of passkeys, and that's probably mostly B2C applications, not within the enterprise. It's probably much lower. So I think we're going to have passwords around for a while, but we can still encourage users to do the most secure thing. And I think that's ultimately what we want to do.
So let's talk about deployment here, if we can, for a second, because you've got a lot of experience in this space. I think you've highlighted some of the usability challenges around this. There's people probably think of this like, yeah, I'd love to roll out a password vault, for my users. What are some tips or some guidance to make life easier for us to help with that?
Yeah. I think part of it is, not trying to do this perfectly. And probably I scared a lot of practitioners off saying, oh my God, but it's got to be seamless. It's got to work for everybody all the time. But I think, setting a benchmark to improve your governance through that deployment is, step one. So getting buy-in from a stakeholder. In terms of practical implementation, start small. Start with the teams that are probably already using a password manager, but it's probably their personal one, right? So yeah, I'm talking about people like us, the identity practitioners, the folks that are in cybersecurity, or the folks that are in IT more broadly. Start with those folks who probably want this anyways. And then move into some of the departments where there's solid use case, right? So we see, a lot of use cases in marketing. They've got access to, way more tools than the average knowledge worker does a lot of times. And many of those platforms go unintegrated because, it's only 1% or less of the organization's employees who are accessing those tools. So marketing is a good second stop. And, creating a good education program. We saw one organization who actually started to gamify it. So gamification is always a good option. It'll definitely accelerate your early adopters and kind of that middle pack. And then, eventually you're going to get to those people who are slow to change. Those people take a little bit more work, a little bit more coaching. Sometimes they need the stick, right? And one of the tools that this gives you, not saying you should always use it, is once you start to put managed credentials in the safe and actually start to actively rotate them, then you create a necessity for people to start to use it. But the nice part, I think, about this is that you can go on this kind of journey of maturity and meet people where they're at for the most part until you get to the very end. That last, 5 to 10% can always be tricky. But I think it's really as with any project in the identity space, change management is a critical part of it, training people on how to use it, helping them understand why it's going to make their job easier.
So how do you measure success for something like this? Because I think about it as like, is it like number of vaults deployed, actively being used? Is it number of credentials being managed by the password manager? Like, what are some of the ways that you've seen people sort of measure, like, yes, hey, we made an investment in Bravura and we're getting, what we hoped out of it?
Yeah. Okay. So when we're coming at this from you're an organization who's on this passwordless journey, we've got 80%, but we're missing this 20%. We'll always look at, okay, well, what are those 20%, right? And that's one of the key measurements we look at for success, is to say, okay, by the end of this 6-month journey, there's not a whole lot of project work that goes into it, but at the end of this 6 to 12 month journey, you should have, 100% of your applications either covered by a passwordless sign-on mechanism, or they should be managed by a tool like ours, where the users aren't having to set the passwords, reset the passwords, etc. There's a bunch of other metrics you can look at as well. I mean, this goes back to traditional self-service password metrics, which is look at your help desk call volume. How many password resets are they processing on a daily basis? Survey on lockouts. How many people actually forgot their password and locked themselves out? So there's a lot of metrics that you can use, but I think really, the core ones from a cybersecurity standpoint are really, are you getting 100% coverage? The other nicety that you get with even just a password manager, regardless of managing credentials, is you can get insight into what else people are logging into. It's kind of the whole shadow IT problem. And then you can start to address those as well slowly. Maybe it's, that one team in finance who's using some tax solution nobody's ever heard of, and you had no idea that, you've got 500 people in that department using that system. So can also help with that. And that can be another metric for success.
That never happens. People using tools that aren't the IT standard. Come on, Bart, you're crazy.
Yeah, never, right?
This has been a pretty fascinating conversation. And my mind has shifted on this quite a bit over the years. I mentioned, I just didn't see a future for this type of space because, WebAuthn and passwordless was going to solve all the problems. Here we are. And now something like this is absolutely vital to making sure that I have a good experience just as an end user. So if this gives me capability as a IAM leader or security leader to say, hey, now I can manage these credentials in a more secure, but a win from a usability standpoint, I think it makes a lot of sense to look at for sure.
Agreed.
So let's end the conversation here on a lighter note. You talked a little bit about risk management, and I was kind of getting to know you before we hit record. And I'll kick down the fourth wall a little bit. Caroline was on the call, and we were kind of talking about, and you were being very modest about some of the risks that you've taken. And you mentioned that you like climbing, mountain climbing, skiing. You're up in the Calgary area, so you've got access to plenty of that stuff. I'm curious if you have any harrowing stories or things that are like, for someone like me who's an indoor cat, I'm not about going outdoors and climbing and doing all that kind of stuff. Scare the heck out of me. Like, what's something that's like, oh my gosh, can't believe you're here to tell that story, Bart?
Yeah, I mean, I'm definitely an outdoor cat. I think it comes naturally living in Calgary. We have, I like to say we have 2 seasons. We have summer that lasts about 2 months, and then we have winter. So if you can't get outside during the winter and actually enjoy everything that we have around us, I mean, we're just 45 minutes from Banff and Lake Louise, the Rockies, etc. Then I think you're going to be very bored living in Calgary. So yeah, I do all the fun things that involve a lot of risk management because I apparently don't get enough of that during the day. One of those stories, so we were up in the Rogers Pass, beautiful place. There's a cabin up, it's like 2,100 meters above sea level. For those of the viewers that are going to be in US, you'll have to convert that into feet. I don't do the conversion, but I think it's somewhere around 8,000 feet. And on the way into this cabin, we were skiing in an area that's lovingly referred to as the Mousetrap. And that's because there's a bunch of these different slopes that all funnel into this kind of creek bed. And it's somewhat dangerous to be in there in the winter. But it's a risk management exercise. So you do all the right things and you space each other apart. You have the training, you have the gear, etc. Going in one year, we actually had a situation where one of my skiing partners was actually behind me. I think I was in the lead, and we had we call them like tree bombs. So basically, just when a tree branch gets heavy enough with snow, usually because it's melting, and a piece of snow comes off of it, and it triggered this like little mini avalanche. It wasn't huge, but it was big enough to bury my partner up to his neck. And I heard all sorts of screaming behind me, and I looked back and I did not see my ski partner. I was like, oh, that's a problem. And then I quickly spotted him kind of buried next to a tree, head above, but no injuries. Everybody was fine. We all continued on and enjoyed the weekend, but definitely a moment that had my heart palpitating or racing a little bit faster than normal. So
mine's going a little bit now, just hearing you describe that. I can't think of anything worse than being on the side of a mountain in the cold and being buried under the snow. Even if it's, I don't care if it's just up to my knees. I'm like, I'm good. You say up to your neck. It's like, okay. So how quickly does that event occur? Like I can understand snow coming off the, off the branch, but
Yeah.
then how much time does it take to that turn into your friend, buried neck deep in snow? Curious how quickly that was.
Yeah, it's so quick. I mean, if you look at like any footage of avalanches, the speed at which they move is astonishing. It's kind of like it's described like a mattress on like steel rollers. It just like slides without friction, basically. So, yeah, probably all told from the time the little bit of snow dropped off the tree branch to the time that I looked back was probably 10-15 seconds at most. But then you have the training and the instincts kick in, and I don't think I've ever skied backwards so fast in my life to get back and unpack my shovel and start digging them out. And I mean, all was good. So happy to talk about the story and reflect on it. But yeah.
Yeah, we probably wouldn't bring it up on a podcast if things turned out in a negative
It wouldn't be a
way.
lighter note.
Right. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, exactly.
Jim, I know you're a little bit of an outdoorsy guy. You've done some cool stuff. Got any harrowing stories?
I had my day, yeah. So we started talking about this. I thought of a time where I was backpacking in Yosemite. So there's this area called Tuolumne Creek. It's like 15 miles from the Yosemite Valley, which is what everybody thinks of. But it was like a 15-mile hike, but there's so much up and down, and you start at like a 10,000 foot elevation. I think the high point might be 12,000. It's really high. There's not the same level of oxygen up there. Let's put it that way. And anyway, so you hike about halfway and then you backpack or you, set up camp somewhere. So we set up camp. It was in the woods and it was like everything was bone dry. I mean, it was what I would call like, I think the term tinderbox would fit this appropriately, right? Like there was no outdoor, like no setting up a campfire. You had to be real careful with how you cooked, everything like that. And so anyway, sun goes down. We're in our tent and it's just like static electricity everywhere. Like you move your arm and like you see these giant sparks arcing across the tent. And I'm like, I've never seen anything like this. And it was not raining, but there was a lightning storm all around us. And I was thinking like, now I see why people get struck by lightning. I'm not worried about bears attacking anymore. I'm worried about getting struck by lightning or this whole place going up in flames and us being in like not a good place. So fortunately, none of that happened. That's why I can talk about it on later. But yeah, it was really scary.
Well, you guys have sufficiently not convinced me to go outside for either of these types of activities. Jim, you talked about like cooking and not being able to like have a fire. I mean, the answer to that is simple. Just DoorDash something out into the woods.
Yeah, sure. That would have worked perfectly.
All right, let's go ahead and wrap up this conversation. Bart, it's been great getting to know you here and what Bravura brings to the table. Any final words you want to put out there for the audience that's listening?
Yeah, I mean, I think as practitioners, we often look for like the perfect silver bullet solution. I think a lot of the real world operational implementation is a lot less than a silver bullet, maybe a few. And so I'd really kind of encourage folks who are maybe on the passwordless journey to think, okay, well, what problem are we actually trying to solve? And, there's multiple ways to slice and dice it. And to still get the same net effect where you're increasing your, cybersecurity posture. So I think that's what I'd leave them with.
I think
Don't
that's
be
great.
perfect.
Yeah, I mean, it's okay to get smarter. It's okay to get better. It doesn't have to be all in one jump. I'll have links in our show notes for people to connect with you on LinkedIn. You can find out more about Bravura there. You can also find out more about Bravura at bravurasecurity.com/IDAC. Again, BRAVURA security.com/IDAC. Reach out to Bart on LinkedIn, make the connection, maybe share mousetrap stories from Rogers Pass. I think I got that right. Or commiserate with Jim and his static electricity stories, or me as, an indoor person who is probably by the fire, with strong Wi-Fi and or air conditioning. So we'll go ahead and leave it there for this week. I want to thank everyone for watching and listening. Thanks to Bravura for sponsoring this episode. Find us on the web, idacpodcast.com, and we'll leave it there. So thanks everyone for watching and listening, and we'll talk with y'all in the next one.
You've been listening to Identity at the Center. We hope you've enjoyed the show. Make sure to like, rate, and review. And we'll be back soon. But in the meantime, hit the website at identityatthecenter.com. See you next time on Identity at the Center.